these assessments.
I call Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I just want to make a reasonably short contribution on this legislation. We don't support the bill and will continue to vote against it. But there are some very interesting issues that have been raised around this legislation and just around the housing debate in general. We met today with a number of leaders of the church community, and I understand they met with other political parties as well over the day. And housing was an issue that was raised by them and by us. It's a major issue for the country, and it was noted that it was very good that housing is a major issue across the political spectrum and across the community sector, ordinary families and the private sector. And there is at least some advantage in the fact that we are all discussing the issues around housing, the complexity of the housing problem, the housing crisis that we have. Most agree that there is a housing crisis. We might disagree on the extent. And I certainly understand National has said over and over that they don't believe there's a crisis, but they certainly know that there is a deficit in housing and that there is a real issue for those who are homeless and those who are the most vulnerable. So we have at least made some progress in the last little while in developing some kind of common understanding that at least housing is critical. Where we have not reached any real consensus at all is on what to do about it. And unfortunately, this legislation is a really clear example of the political divide, because the primary purpose of this legislation is to prevent more people from getting access to social housing. That is what the reviewable tenancy process does. It is primarily designed to move people out of the existing social housing stock and into the arms of other organisations that aren't being properly funded and can't cope with the influx. So it is really unfortunate that the housing legislation that we debate, when we all agree that there is a housing issue, we all agree that vulnerable families who are in urgent need of housing are not getting it, we all agree that there is a deficit of housing at the affordable end of the market, we all understand, at least, I would imagine, if others have access to the facts, that home ownership amongst the middle class is also declining. You know, this is all publicly available information. And yet the one piece of legislation that we are debating is a legislation that will reduce the security of the most vulnerable families in the very difficult housing environments that they have. And that's a real tragedy, that's what we're spending our time on. The arguments for this legislation from the National Party have been around the greatest need. There's the greatest need argument. There is also the market rents argument. So we heard from Samuel Tuinga about how this social housing should be made available to those with the greatest need. Now, that you might agree with that as a general statement, but it depends on your definition of greatest need. And if the intention is to squeeze more and more people out of social housing and for the government to reduce its involvement in social housing, then the greatest need, the criteria for meeting this threshold of greatest need becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. So fewer and fewer people meet that threshold and have access. I mean, that's so the words are all fine to use. It's actually the devil is always in these matters in the detail. So I think about a couple of cases that I have at the moment and that I'm managing through my office in Dunedin. I mentioned this case in the second reading, a woman who has been working, her and her husband have been working very hard. They have 2 children, one of whom has a very severe disability. They take SIFS kids, so they are fostering other children in order to assist those children in the state and taking care of children that are in state care. Her husband has a very severe fatal form of cancer and is no longer able to work. She has to care for her children and for her husband and is no longer able to work. So their ability to access their housing in the private market has now been completely constrained, and she doesn't meet the criteria for greatest need. She doesn't meet this criteria for greatest. So Samuel Tuinga can stand up and say this housing is available to those who have the greatest need. Not to her, it doesn't. Not to her, it doesn't. So she has to get intervention She requires an MP to intervene on her behalf in order to try to get her further up the list so that she does, even if she doesn't meet the National Party's criteria of greatest need, she at least has some chance of getting into social housing. And now, of course, once this legislation passes, she may well get access to a state house, but she has no security of tenure. There is absolutely no way that she can be assured that she can raise her children and the SIFs, the children in state care that she takes care of, and cares for her husband towards the end of his life with any sense of security. Because if, for example, her income changes slightly, perhaps she gets a part-time job because things are going well, then she could well be subject to a review and therefore to market rents. And one of the other parts of the detail, I guess, that the National Party members are failing to describe, they talk about how so many people who are renting state houses are paying market rent, and that this is a sign that these people are excessively wealthy and are not entitled, therefore, to any form of social assistance. Well, let's just remember that the market rent approach or calculation kicks in at about the level of New Zealand superannuation. So for a single person, that's about $350 a week. For a married couple, that's around $500 and a bit a week. So at that point, when a married couple is earning a bit over $500 a week, they are subject to a market rent calculation by Housing New Zealand. And so they won't be entitled to an income-related rent subsidy. They will have to pay a market rent according to Housing New Zealand at that low income threshold. So even these families who are in desperate need, who are trying to find some stability in their lives, who are looking to social housing to provide that stability so they can get back on their feet a little bit, when they do start to get back on their feet, are penalised for doing okay. They're penalised for earning a little bit extra income. They're penalised for getting a part-time job. They're penalised for having some sense of security. They're penalised for doing well enough, not having, perhaps they have recovered from a mental illness, for example. And actually, I have another case like this. A woman who's living in a 2-bedroom state house, who is with 3 children, who is desperate to move. She's desperate to move into a bigger state home in the neighbourhood in which she has built some strong support. There are state houses in her neighbourhood, 2 streets away from where she lives now, which are on the market. They are 3-bedroom state homes, and they are on the market and they are being sold. And she is desperate to get into a bigger home so she can better take care of her family. And she was told by Housing New Zealand, that she did not qualify for this greatest need threshold because she doesn't have a mental illness. Because she is just managing to care for her children and settle herself in her community and make sure her kids go to school and just managing to keep her head above water, and she is being punished for that because of the threshold of greatest need. And if she was to go and get herself a part-time job in order to bring a little bit more income into her home so she could better take care of her kids, then she risks being subject to a market rent calculation that could mean that her rent rockets up, and she is unable then to afford to live in that state house. And not only that, subject to a reviewable tenancy by this government that could see her lose her home. This is the consequence of this legislation. These are the real cases, the real people that this legislation will impose an enormous burden on. Those families who are just able to get by, who are doing as well as they can in the circumstances, who love their kids, who do everything they can to care for their kids, who are trying to find those little steps, those small steps to get themselves into a better situation. And at every point where they try to improve, they are punished by this government for doing so. And this legislation, with its reviewable tenancies, does exactly that all over again. It is a tragic piece of legislation. It will not help these families at all. It will squeeze more and more families out of housing, drive poverty, drive child poverty. This government really doesn't care for that at all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to take